On today's Ask Zach, we're going to talk about how Leo Fender borrowed this Bigsby guitar and how it was a huge influence on Fender instruments and how Leo never gave Paul Bigsby any credit for that. Well, hello friends and welcome to Ask Zach. Today we have this beautiful copy of the 1948 Merle Travis Paul Bigsby built guitar. It's gorgeous and it just inspired me to do research and to look into this and find out all this crazy information about the connection between Leo Fender and Paul Bigsby and even Les Paul and others. And it's just kind of crazy how all this stuff was happening in Southern California in the late 1940s. So we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about specifically why Leo Fender never gave Paul Bigsby any kind of credit for the huge influence that he was on him and the creation of Fender guitars. So I need to thank everyone that supports the show, my Patreon members, everyone that's done super thanks or bought a t-shirt or a coffee mug. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. All right, I guess we need to give some context first. So most of y'all are familiar with Leo Fender, but you probably know a little less about Paul Bigsby. So Paul was born at the turn of the century, going into 1900, and he was a pattern maker, which meant that he made using wood first and carving it, then he would make molds of that, and then they would use those molds to create metal parts that was used in factories and all sorts of things. He did that, and he was also into hot rodding motorcycles and racing motorcycles, and in fact he won tons of races and was a star. But by the time he was in his 40s, and it was in the 1940s, he had kind of gotten out of racing motorcycles and was doing more announcing and hot rodding of bikes than actually riding them. And during the 1940s, he got into playing music, and he started looking at guitars and steels and different things, and he immediately thought, I could make these things better. Now, one of the top bands at the time was Spade Cooley, and his band had an amazing steel player named Joaquin Murphy. And Paul Bigsby loved Spade Cooley and his band, so he went to go see him, and then he went up to Joaquin and he said, I can make you a steel guitar better than the one you have. And he did. He made him a double neck lap steel with 2 8-string necks on it, and Joaquin loved it and used it on tons of recordings. And then Paul Bigsby made other steels for Joaquin, and then got orders because of Joaquin, who was kind of a big star of the steel guitar, and he had a beautiful tone, beautiful distorted tone that you really need to hear. But because of him using that, this is how it works. Then all of a sudden everyone else wanted one too, and so Paul starts getting a lot of orders, including by a guy that ends up being called Speedy West, and he builds a pedal steel guitar for Speedy, and he uses that same instrument on his recordings with Jimmy Bryant and Tennessee Ernie Ford and all sorts of cats. And just to be clear, Bigsby never invented the pedal steel guitar. That was done earlier, but he, of course, did a version of it that was very popular and ended up being very revolutionary. So let's talk about some other characters. So Southern California was crazy in the late 1940s because you had Paul Bigsby doing this stuff. You had all these Western swing guys. You had Les Paul was out there. And you had another guy who was an amazing guitar player and a singer-songwriter, and his name was Merle Travis. And Merle Travis was on Capitol Records, and he had hits with things like Dark as a Dungeon and 16 Tons and Smoke, Smoke, Smoke That Cigarette. And he was also pretty revolutionary guitar player, and he didn't originate the style, but he was kind of given credit for it, and that's why they call it Travis picking. And he played with a thumb pick and one finger, and he would play, of course, kind of a bass line and melody and kind of rhythm all at the same time. So at the time, Merle was playing a Gibson L10 with a pickup on it and a Kaufman vibrola. And old Travis, he really liked the sound of the steel guitars, and he liked the sustain that they had. So he decided to talk to Paul Bigsby about it, and he said, I want a guitar, I don't want a steel, I want a guitar that has more of that tone and the sustain like a steel guitar. And so Merle drew something on a piece of paper, and in May of 1948, it was done. And it looked pretty much like this, except it didn't have the cutaway, and it had a more gangly headstock where something kind of went up in this direction. But pretty soon, not long after, he builds it, they add the cutaway and they change the headstock. Still, in 1948 to this shape. Okay? They even have to add a little wood to kind of get this part on there because it went up. So, Merle likes the guitar, except it's kind of bright, especially compared to his old Gibson. So they put a selector switch on it with some preset different tones on it. Now this replica does not have that on there, but it had a three-way switch, kind of like an Esquire, with some other tones available to give you kind of a rhythm and a lead sound all out of a one pickup guitar. So Merle's playing this guitar, and he's playing his Gibson L10, and he's playing shows around the country, but of course he's playing shows in Southern California. Well, a guy named Leo Fender comes out to a show, and he asks Merle about the instrument. He says, what do you like about it? What do you not like about it? And so apparently Leo Fender and Don Randall had been having conversations about the possibility of doing an electric Spanish, guitar of some kind. And so Leo's kind of out and about, and he, sees the guitar. He starts talking to Merle, and then he says to Merle, can I borrow the guitar for a week? Now, Merle had to think about it for a second because this is one of his guitars that he's using, but he's also using the Gibson L10, the hollow body. And Merle decides, you know what, I can live without, the Bigsby guitar for a week. And so Leo Fender takes the Bigsby guitar, and he's a busy beaver because in the week, when he returns with the guitar to Merle, he also has his own solid body guitar that he's built. Now, it's kind of crude, but we believe this to be the snake headstock, first prototype of the Telecaster, Broadcaster, Nocaster, Esquire thing. And yes, it's crude compared to this because Paul Bigsby was an amazing craftsman who spent an inordinate amount of time making these things. And you have beautiful bird's eye wood that's used. You have all this walnut, all these wonderful flourishes. You have this tailpiece here, and this armrest. All this work around the headstock. You have a headstock overlay. You have not just dot inlays, but you also have these playing card inlays on the neck. Lots and lots of work. So, yeah, Leo goes off and he keeps working on his prototype, and he makes a second prototype. And on the second prototype, he copies another thing that he learned from this guitar. And that's how to put 6 tuners on the same side, how to have a 6-in-a-line tuner headstock, how to get the strings to have straight pull, because that's one of Leo's things that he claims when they start marketing the Broadcaster. He talks about the straight pull. Well, this comes from Bigsby, because Bigsby is the one that figured this out. And the way he did it was he took 2 sets of Kluson machine heads, because at that point it was only available 3 on a side, like you'd see on an acoustic or an electric guitar at that point. And so what he did was he had to take 2 sets, and he had to use all of the bass side tuners, and he used One of them, he left the upper part, and then on the bottom part of the crown, he removed most of it. And then he did the opposite with this one. And then on the four middle ones, he removed the crown on both sides. And then he was able to fit all the tuners together closely and use a single screw in between each tuner to hold it in place. And therefore, you're able to get the tuners close enough together where you can get straight string pull down through the nut and down all the way to the bridge. Paul Bigsby. Another thing was a 7 1/4 radius. People always wonder where the 7 1/4 radius came on Fender guitars. Well, it came from Paul Bigsby's guitars. So, with all of this, Paul Bigsby is kind of okay with it because Paul is developing all sorts of things. He's inventing stuff left and right, and of course, Leo's a great inventor too. But, Paul's not really bothered by it. And he knows that Leo Fender is more into mass producing. So you get up through 1949 and into 1950, and here's where you really get a smoking gun as far as a real admission, not from Leo, but from Don Randall, the other principal at Fender Musical Instruments. Well, at that time it was Fender Electric Instruments. So here is a quote from a letter that Don Randall wrote. So Don Randall was visiting a radio station, and he had one of their Esquire guitars. Again, this is in 1950, so this is before the broadcaster. So this is going to be a single or dual pickup Esquire, maybe Pine, and they've got a Fender Pro amplifier with a 15, and they take it to this radio station, and Don Randall writes a letter about the visit. And here we go. And I quote, "Merle Travis is on the program, and he is one of the country's foremost guitar stylists. He is playing the granddaddy of our Spanish guitar, built by Paul Bigsby, the one Leo copied." There you have it, kids. So now, I want to be fair in this. So Don Randall saying copied, but it wasn't a verbatim copy. It was just heavily influenced by it. And of course, with, the broadcaster, you get all sorts of wonderful, innovations, with, the string tree that he uses, the way the truss rod is installed. You have the bolt-on neck. You have the wonderful bridge and the pickup that has an elevator plate on it so that it can be both grounded and raised and lowered. You have the neck pickup. You have, the pick guard. You have, kind of the stylized shape, the control plate. You're not going to find a bigger fan of Leo Fender than me. But come on, Leo. You should have given credit to old Paul Bigsby. Now, as the years kind of keep going into, 51, 52, etc., Paul Bigsby is working on his vibrato, his vibrola. And the reason he's doing that is because Merle Travis contacted him and said, "I hate this Doc Kaufman vibrola. It won't stay in tune. Can you do something better?" And Paul Bigsby, was, probably claimed all the time. It says in one of these books that he basically said that he could do anything, and so he put his mind to making a better vibrato, and he did. He made the Bigsby vibrato, which is a huge seller, of course, to this day. So one of the things he did, kind of proving that there was no horrible bad blood between Paul and Leo at this point, was in 52, 53, he made a specific Bigsby model vibrato for the Telecaster. It was called the B16, and it's not like the later, B5 or the things that Fender would do later on in the CBS years where they took a B5 and they had the little plate. Now this, went all the way up, and the pickup, the bridge pickup was mounted in it and everything. So that's what's happening in 53. But things go horribly wrong in 1954. In 1954, Paul Bigsby's had enough. And that's because in the summer of 54, Leo Fender introduces this guitar, the Stratocaster. And so now the headstock shape is closer, not further away, because the Telecaster was enough different. But this, Leo's gone too far. So, Paul Bigsby contacts his lawyer. The lawyer contacts the Fender people, and things get ugly. Leo's legal counsel are able to show prior usage by showing, photos of old Croatian instruments and some of these Martin Stauffer guitars where they have 6-in-a-line, tuners on one side, and Leo is able to prevail. And Paul Bigsby's not happy. And, of course, Leo was not about to admit the fact that he borrowed this guitar for a week and, copied, features on it and learned how to do the, grind down Kluson machine heads so you could do 6 on a side. So it's not pretty. So at that point, Fender stops offering Bigsby vibratos on their guitars, and you won't see them on a Fender guitar again until the CBS years. So you probably know, if you're a Telecaster fan, that, of course, CBS Fender started offering, Bigsby's, pretty soon after CBS bought Fender out in 65. Bigsby keeps innovating, and he keeps making custom instruments. He makes cool double neck for Grady Martin, and one of the really cool things he does is Merle Travis loves his Bigsby guitar so much that he wanted the same neck on an acoustic. So Bigsby took Merle Travis's, Martin D28, removed the neck, and put a neck just like this on it. And the funny thing about that is that, of course, Bigsby does it on a couple, he does it on quite a few guitars where he re-necks them. Well, what does it look like? Well, it looks like the Fender acoustics of the 1960s. So, another kind of blow. But, again, Paul Bigsby doesn't, he kind of stays a little bit, unhappy with Leo. And Merle Travis is pretty unhappy with Leo, too, because Merle kind of feels like he's been cheated because he basically helped start the solid body revolution with his instrument, and he doesn't get anything out of it. He didn't get anything from Leo. He didn't get anything from Gibson either, because the only reason Gibson makes the Les Paul guitar is because of Leo Fender, who only made a solid body because of Paul Bigsby. So Paul didn't get anything out of that. Neither did Merle Travis. So things start, just keep rolling on through the late 50s and into the 60s. And of course, Leo makes all sorts of innovations. He makes the P bass. He makes the Bassman amplifier. He makes, the Jazzmaster Jaguar jazz bass. He makes some killer instruments and does a lot of innovation. But by, 63 or so, he's getting pretty tired. He's getting tired running a company, and he's starting to have these chronic, kind of strep sinus infections. And he talks to Don Randall, and they decide to sell the company. And so in January 65, they sell. So Don Randall and Leo Fender sell out to CBS in January of 1965. Also in 1965, Ted McCarty, who of course only started making Les Paul guitars because of Leo Fender and Paul Bigsby, goes to Paul Bigsby. So Ted McCarty visits Paul Bigsby in late 1965, and Paul is way behind on making vibratos. He's very unhappy because he never wanted to get into mass production. He always wanted to make these custom things, but everyone wants his vibrato. So Ted McCarty says, I'll buy you out. And Paul's happy to sell. And so Ted McCarty, still head of Gibson at that point, buys Bigsby out. Lock, stock, and barrel. Ted McCarty goes back to CMI, his bosses that owned Gibson. They offer to buy Bigsby from him because, again, Ted McCartney didn't buy it for Gibson. He bought it for himself. Those guys offer to give him $50,000 over what he paid for it, and Ted sees the writing on the wall. He doesn't want to work for these guys anymore. He just bought this company that he knows that he can run better, and so he gives his resignation and he leaves Gibson and runs Bigsby and does quite well with it. So it's interesting how, things played out. And one of the things that happens, in the late 1960s is you get Guitar Player magazine, and you get the beginnings of guitar journalism. Guys like Tom Wheeler and all these wonderful cats that a lot of them have passed on at this point. But they start interviewing these guys like Leo Fender and Paul Bigsby and Don Randall and all these other cats. And they start, trying to get the story. And so when they talk to Leo Fender, Leo doesn't talk about Paul Bigsby. And when they say, well, where did the headstock come from? And he says, oh, these Croatian instruments. He just basically mimics, what their legal defense was back in the mid-50s. And so we don't get the truth. So, yeah. So what are the reasons why, Leo never gave Paul Bigsby credit? Well, one is the lawsuit. The second is Leo was a proud man. And he was a great man that did a lot of great things, but unfortunately, he really didn't like to give people credit. He didn't like to give his endorsers, his employees, or especially a guy like Paul Bigsby credit. And so he left their names out, which, left it open for, a lot of former Fender employees and endorsers to act like they were the reason that certain instruments or models existed. And it is what it is. But, Leo made some wonderful instruments, and of course, Music Man and G&L, and just continued to innovate up until his death. And, fortunately, Paul Bigsby was quite a bit older, and so he passed away in 1968. But all those guys really did a lot of important things. And it's unfortunate that Bigsby is not given the credit he deserves. Because no, the Fender guitar was not an outright copy of this guitar, but there were so many things on this guitar that were just a huge influence on Leo, and Leo owed it to give some credit to old Paul Bigsby. And the least we can do is try to correct some of that now, and just give credit to Paul Bigsby and his huge influence on the Fender guitar. I need to give thanks to two writers and two books that were immensely helpful in creating this episode. First off would be 16 Tons, the Merle Travis story by Merle Travis and Deke Dickerson. This is a wonderful book on the life of Merle Travis, one of the great singer-songwriter guitar players. And there is a whole chapter on the creation of the Bigsby guitar, and there are the hand-drawn, the drawings that Merle did, for the design of this guitar. And there's also photos of the instrument without a cutaway and with the first headstock shape. This is a great book. Also, the Andy Babuik's book on Bigsby, which, this is a wonderful book, and that gives all sorts of great information on, of course, Paul's early days and as a, racing motorcycles. And then, of course, there's a whole chapter on Bigsby and Fender, and really, really great stuff. So if you want to do a deep dive, I highly recommend that you get these books, and I'll put a link in the description, and hopefully they're all still in print and I don't get in trouble with you guys. All right. Well, I hope you've enjoyed today's episode, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.